"She's not what I ordered," the groom said, loud enough for the whole station to hear, and the wind carried his words farther than the train smoke ever could. The 10:15 from St. Louis had barely finished hissing to a stop when Clara May Whitmore stepped down onto the wooden platform, her boots touching Kansas dust for the first time, her gloved hand gripping a worn leather suitcase that had crossed nearly 900 miles with her. And for a moment she believed the journey had been worth it. The town of Dry Creek looked smaller than she imagined, just a water tower, a general store, and a depot no wider than 40 feet. But she had not come for scenery. She had come for a beginning, and she spotted Ethan Caldwell right away because he stood straight-backed near the ticket window holding a folded newspaper like a man expecting a delivery, his hat tipped low, his boots polished, his expression already measuring. Clara lifted her chin, smoothing the front of her traveling dress, aware that she was broader than the delicate women pictured in catalog sketches, aware that her waist did not taper like an hourglass, aware of the long winter evenings spent sewing shirts by lamplight instead of strolling in gardens. But she carried herself the way her mother taught her, shoulders square, eyes forward, as if dignity weighed less than shame. The conductor set down her trunk with a dull thud, and Ethan stepped closer, his gaze traveling from her hat to her boots in one slow, unmistakable sweep that felt colder than the January wind she had left behind, and he did not offer his hand, did not offer a greeting. Only that sentence again, softer now but sharp enough to cut. "You look different." And a few men leaning against the depot wall let out short, nervous chuckles that tried to pass for humor. Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but her spine did not bend. She had answered an advertisement that promised partnership, hard work, and respect on a cattle ranch 2 miles outside town, not romance from a dime novel. And nowhere in those careful letters had Ethan mentioned measurements. Nowhere had he written that kindness came in inches. A freight wagon rattled past on Main Street. A dog barked somewhere near the livery stable, and still the silence on that platform stretched longer than a prairie mile, because everyone understood what was happening even if no one wanted to name it. Ethan cleared his throat and shook his head as though a merchant dissatisfied with goods, saying he had expected someone smaller, someone more suitable, and the word suitable hung in the air like dust caught in sunlight, visible, inescapable. Clara's fingers tightened around the suitcase handle until the leather creaked. She could feel the ticket stub still tucked inside her pocket, the return passage she could claim if she chose, but she did not reach for it. Instead, she met his eyes, steady and calm, and in that gaze there was no plea, only a quiet recognition that this was not the first time the world had tried to measure her and found her excessive. The train whistle blew again, steam rolling across the platform in thick white clouds, and through it she heard another murmur ripple through the crowd. Not cruel exactly, but curious, the way townsfolk observe a summer storm gathering over flat land. Ethan stepped back as if to create distance between himself and what he considered a mistake, and Clara understood then that the journey had not ended at this depot. It had only shifted direction, because a woman can travel 900 miles and still find herself exactly where she began, judged by the space she occupies. And as the smoke cleared and the train began to pull away, leaving her standing alone on the boards of Dry Creek Station, the real story did not start with rejection. It started with who would dare to see her differently. Clara May Whitmore did not cry on the platform, and she did not look back at Ethan Caldwell as the train pulled away and the last of the passengers scattered toward Main Street. She stood still until the steam thinned and the boards beneath her boots stopped trembling. Then she lifted her suitcase with both hands and stepped down from the depot, as if she had planned to walk alone all along. The weight of the leather pressing into her palms, but not nearly as heavy as the silence that followed her across the dusty road. Dry Creek measured less than half a mile from the water tower to the far fence line, and every storefront window seemed to hold a reflection of her passing figure. The milliner pausing mid-stitch, the barber leaning out his door with a towel over one shoulder, 2 boys sitting on a hitching rail whispering without subtlety. She had grown accustomed to whispers back in Missouri, to the way shopkeepers spoke slowly, as if extra pounds meant a lack of sense. But she had believed the West might value strength differently, that out here, where winters froze water buckets solid and summers baked the earth to cracked clay, a woman built solid might be considered an asset rather than an error. Her boots kicked up fine grit as she walked the 100 yards toward the boarding house at the corner of Pine and 3rd, a narrow building with faded blue shutters and a sign that read rooms by the week, and each step felt deliberate, not hurried, because haste would look like retreat. Inside the lobby, the air smelled of boiled cabbage and coal smoke, and Mrs. Garrison, a widow with sharp spectacles and sharper eyes, glanced up from her ledger long enough to assess the situation without asking for details, the news having traveled faster than Clara's footsteps. "You will be wanting a room," the widow said, not unkindly, and Clara answered yes with a steady voice, setting her suitcase on the counter as coins clinked from her purse. Money she had saved stitch by stitch over years of mending shirts for men who never learned her name. As she signed the register, she felt the faint tremor in her hand and forced it still, because names mattered, and she intended hers to remain written somewhere in this town, even if not on a ranch deed. Upstairs, the hallway stretched barely 20 feet, narrow and dim, and her assigned room contained a single iron bed, a wash basin, and a window no wider than 2 feet that overlooked the livery stable. Yet when she placed her suitcase on the quilt and removed her gloves, she moved with care, smoothing the fabric, setting her hat on the small dresser, creating order from rejection. Through the thin glass she could see the depot roof in the distance and the figure of Ethan speaking animatedly to a cluster of townsfolk, his gestures broad, his laughter easy now that the decision had been made. And she understood that humiliation lingered longer than train smoke, but so did resolve. She crossed the small room in 3 measured steps and looked at herself in the mirror, not searching for flaw because she knew them all already, but searching for surrender and finding none. And when she removed the return ticket from her pocket, she held it between her fingers for a long moment before folding it once more and placing it back inside her purse, because leaving would be simple, but staying required the kind of strength that could not be weighed on any scale in Dry Creek. Morning in Dry Creek arrived without ceremony, the sun lifting slow and pale over the water tower while Clara May Whitmore sat at the small washstand in her boarding house room and pinned her hair with steady hands, as if the town outside had not already formed its opinion. The sounds of wagons rolling over packed dirt drifted through her narrow window, along with the smell of coffee from the cafe across the street, and she allowed herself exactly one deep breath before standing, smoothing her dark blue day dress, the fabric plain but clean, the seams strong because she had stitched them herself. Downstairs, Mrs. Garrison pretended to study her ledger while watching Clara descend the staircase, and though no unkind words were spoken, the air carried a question that did not need voicing. "What will you do now?" Clara answered that question not with explanation, but with action, stepping back onto Pine Street and turning toward the row of businesses as if she had always belonged there. The general store stood 40 yards from the boarding house, its wooden sign creaking in the mild breeze, and inside Mr. Talbot weighed flour on brass scales while 2 ranch hands leaned against a barrel of nails discussing the weather and the woman from the train. Their conversation paused when Clara entered, and she felt their eyes measure her again, but she did not shrink. She waited until Mr. Talbot finished with his customer and then asked, in a voice even and clear, whether he needed help with mending feed sacks or keeping inventory. The shopkeeper hesitated, scratching his chin, glancing at the ranch hands who watched with thin smiles, and he replied that business was tight and space tighter. Though Clara noticed the stack of torn burlap near the counter and the ledger balanced unevenly on a crate, she thanked him politely and moved on, her steps unhurried, because desperation invites dismissal. At the cafe, she offered to wash dishes or bake bread, and the cook, a stout woman with flour on her apron, studied Clara's hands instead of her figure, noticing the small calluses on her fingertips and the faint needle marks, and for a moment something like consideration flickered there before being replaced by caution, as if hiring her might stir more gossip than the town could stomach before noon. Outside, a group of boys trailed her at a distance of 10 paces, whispering, not cruel exactly, but curious, the way children test the boundaries of difference, and Clara paused long enough to meet their eyes, offering a small nod that unsettled them more than anger would have. By mid-morning, she had walked nearly every storefront within the half-mile stretch of Main Street, the sun warming her shoulders, dust clinging to the hem of her skirt, Rejection offered in softer tones than the depot, but rejection all the same, and still she did not reach for the return ticket resting in her purse. Instead, she stopped at the edge of town where the road bent toward the open prairie, fields stretching flat and endless beyond the last fence line. And she looked out over the land that had promised her partnership and found herself calculating not miles but possibilities, because a town may close its doors for a day, but the horizon remains open. And Clara May Whitmore had not traveled 900 miles to let a single sentence decide the rest of her story. By late afternoon, the sun hung low over Dry Creek, casting long amber shadows that stretched across the rutted road like quiet accusations. And Clara May Whitmore remained standing at the edge of town longer than most would have thought proper for a woman alone, her gaze fixed on the prairie as if it might answer her with something steadier than rumor. The wind moved through the tall grass beyond the last fence post, bending it in slow waves that shimmered under the fading light, and she felt the weight of the day settle into her shoulders, not as defeat but as realization, because rejection spoken once at a depot could echo through every storefront if allowed. Behind her, a wagon rolled past carrying sacks of feed, the driver glancing at her with open curiosity before turning his horse toward the Caldwell Ranch Road 2 miles west, and she understood that Ethan's version of the morning had likely traveled faster than she had. Still, she did not hurry back to the boarding house. She adjusted the strap of her suitcase, which she had carried out of habit more than necessity, and began walking slowly along the outer road where town noise softened into the rhythm of hooves and distant cattle calls. About a quarter-mile from Main Street stood a small property set apart from the others, a modest ranch house with weathered white paint and a barn that leaned slightly but remained upright through stubborn will, and smoke curled thinly from its chimney though it was not yet evening. Clara noticed the place because it did not bustle like the Caldwell spread. There were no hired hands gathered in loud circles, no polished sign announcing ownership, only a fence that had been mended in places with careful hands and patience. As she passed the gate, she heard the measured sound of an axe striking wood, steady and unhurried, and a tall man in a faded brown coat paused mid-swing when he saw her, resting the axe head against a stump rather than gripping it tight. His face carried lines not of anger, but of long seasons worked under sun and snow, and his eyes held something quieter than judgment, something that did not flinch. Clara inclined her head slightly in greeting, offering no explanation, and he returned the nod with equal restraint, neither staring nor looking away too quickly. The silence between them felt different from the silence at the depot, less like scrutiny and more like space. A breeze lifted the edge of her skirt, carrying the faint scent of hay and wood smoke, and for the first time since stepping off the train, she felt the tension in her chest ease by a small degree, not because anything had changed, but because this man, whoever he was, had not measured her in inches or expectation. She continued down the road without stopping, aware of his gaze, only in the sense that it followed without pressure, and as the sun dipped lower and painted the horizon in soft gold, Clara realized that while a town may decide quickly what a woman is worth, there are always those who wait before speaking, and sometimes the quietest witness becomes the one who alters the course of a life. Clara May Whitmore returned to the boarding house just as dusk settled over Dry Creek, the sky fading from amber to a deep blue that softened the hard edges of the town. And though her steps were steady, her thoughts moved faster than her boots, circling the quiet ranch house a quarter-mile beyond the last fence post, and the man who had paused his work rather than stare. Inside the dining room of Mrs. Garrison's establishment, a long wooden table stretched nearly 12 feet, already set with tin plates and chipped cups, and 3 boarders spoke in low tones that faltered when Clara entered, the scrape of her chair against the floorboards louder than their conversation. She took her seat without apology, folded her hands in her lap, and listened as the talk drifted inevitably toward the morning at the depot, one man remarking that Ethan Caldwell had been wise to be particular, that a ranch demanded a certain appearance beside it, as if livestock and wives were weighed on the same scale. Clara kept her gaze on the steam rising from her bowl of stew, breathing in the scent of potatoes and salt pork, and when Mrs. Garrison placed a slice of bread beside her plate, their eyes met for a brief second, not in pity but in acknowledgement. After supper, Clara carried her dish to the wash basin and cleaned it carefully, her movements precise, unwilling to leave behind even a trace of burden. And later in her narrow room, she unpacked the few belongings she owned, laying out her sewing kit on the small desk near the window, the polished thimble catching the lamplight. She threaded a needle with calm fingers and began mending a tear along the hem of her skirt, each stitch even and deliberate, the quiet rhythm of work steadying her heartbeat. Outside, hoofbeats passed along Pine Street, followed by laughter that drifted upward through the glass, and she recognized Ethan's voice among them, confident and untroubled, as if the morning had been nothing more than an inconvenient shipment returned. Clara did not move toward the window to confirm it. She did not need proof of what she already understood. Instead, she continued stitching until the seam lay flat and strong, stronger perhaps than before it had torn. When the lamp burned low, she set the needle aside and removed the return ticket from her purse once more, holding it between her fingers as the flame flickered, measuring the thin rectangle of paper against the thicker weight of her resolve. She imagined the train whistle, the long ride east, the safety of familiar streets where disappointment at least had a known shape. And then she imagined the prairie again, wide and unclaimed, and the quiet ranch house where a man had chosen to look without judgment. Slowly she folded the ticket in half, then in half again, and placed it not back into her purse but into the bottom drawer of the desk, beneath her sewing kit, as if tucking away the easier path. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the boarding house walls, and Clara lay down on the iron bed, staring at the ceiling while shadows shifted across the plaster, understanding that staying would require more courage than leaving, but also knowing that somewhere beyond the town lights there was land that did not laugh, and perhaps a man who measured worth by something other than inches. The next morning arrived cool and pale, a thin veil of mist stretching low over the prairie as Clara May Whitmore stepped out of the boarding house with her sewing kit tucked beneath her arm instead of hidden in a drawer, because resolve meant little if it remained folded away. Pine Street was quieter at that early hour, the general store not yet open, the saloon doors still closed, and she walked past them without hesitation, turning instead toward the outer road where the town gave way to open land, and the air smelled less of gossip and more of hay. The modest ranch house she had noticed the evening before stood unchanged in the soft light, its fence patched carefully with different shades of wood, proof of repairs made over years rather than replaced in haste. And near the barn a man was bent over a broken gate hinge, tools spread neatly on the ground beside him. He straightened when he heard her boots on gravel, not startled, only aware, and rested his hammer on the fence rail, before removing his hat in a gesture that felt older than the town itself. Up close, she could see that his coat had been mended at the elbow with thread a shade darker than the original fabric. Practical and unashamed, and his eyes studied her face rather than the outline of her body. "Morning," he said, his voice even, carrying no edge, and she returned the greeting with the same calm tone. For a brief second they stood with nothing between them but the early sun and the space of a few feet, and then Clara lifted the sewing kit slightly, as if it were explanation enough. She told him she was looking for work, any honest task that required steady hands, and she spoke without hurry, because pleading would bend her posture, and she had worked too hard to keep it straight. The man listened fully before answering, his gaze drifting toward the barn where a stack of torn feed sacks leaned against the wall, and a shirt hung on a nail with a sleeve split clean down the seam. "I could use someone who knows how to mend things," he said finally, not as charity, but as fact. And the words settled between them with the weight of opportunity rather than favor. She stepped closer to examine the shirt, running her fingers along the torn fabric, assessing the work the way a carpenter might measure timber, and she nodded once, confident. He introduced himself then as Samuel Reed, owner of the small ranch that produced fewer cattle than the Caldwell spread, but enough to keep a roof overhead and a table set for one. And he did not ask why she was in Dry Creek nor mention the depot. As if a person's past did not require inspection before offering a task, Clara knelt beside the fence post and set her sewing kit on the ground, the polished thimble glinting in the sunlight, and began threading her needle while Samuel returned to his hinge, the steady tap of his hammer and the soft pull of her thread forming a quiet rhythm that felt almost like partnership. There were no curious onlookers at that distance from town, only the sound of wind moving across open fields and the faint lowing of cattle beyond the barn. And for the first time since stepping off the train, Clara sensed that the measure of her worth might be decided not by laughter on a wooden platform, but by the strength of a seam pulled tight under clear morning light. By midday the sun stood high over the prairie, casting a bright and honest light across Samuel Reed's small ranch, and Clara May Whitmore remained seated on a low wooden stool near the barn wall, her sewing kit open beside her like a quiet declaration that she intended to stay longer than an hour. The torn feed sacks lay in a neat pile to her left, and one by one she drew them across her lap, stitching the frayed edges together with firm, even pulls that left no slack in the seam, while Samuel worked a few yards away repairing a section of fence that had bowed under winter wind. There was no unnecessary talk between them, only the steady rhythm of effort, the scrape of wood against wood, the whisper of threads sliding through burlap, and occasionally the soft sound of cattle shifting in the shade. Clara noticed how Samuel moved, deliberate rather than hurried, as if he understood that rushing rarely fixed what truly needed tending. And when he paused to wipe his brow with a folded handkerchief, he glanced at her work without intrusion, nodding once at the straightness of her lines. After nearly an hour, he walked toward the barn and returned with a split sleeve from his work shirt, holding it out not like a favor asked, but like a tool requiring attention, and she accepted it with a small acknowledgement, examining the tier before setting to work. The fabric was worn but clean, and as her needle moved through cotton, she felt the simple satisfaction of usefulness settle over her shoulders, replacing the hollow ache that had followed her from the depot. In the distance, a rider approached along the outer road, dust lifting behind the horse in a pale trail that caught the sunlight, and Clara recognized the upright posture even before she made out the face. Ethan Caldwell reined in near the fence line, surveying the scene with narrowed eyes, his gaze traveling from Samuel to Clara and then to the neat stack of mended sacks by her stool. He offered a brief greeting that held more curiosity than courtesy, remarking that he had not expected to see her still in town, and Samuel answered with quiet composure that honest work had a way of finding those willing to do it. Clara did not look up immediately, allowing the thread to pass through the final inch of fabric before tying a secure knot, and only then did she meet Ethan's gaze, not with defiance, but with steadiness. There was no apology in her expression, no trace of the humiliation that had once hovered at the edge of her composure, only the calm assurance of someone engaged in purpose. Ethan shifted in his saddle, glancing at the repaired fence and the orderly yard, perhaps measuring again, perhaps reconsidering. But whatever calculation moved behind his eyes remained unspoken. After a brief exchange about cattle prices and dry weather, he tipped his hat and turned his horse back toward town, the dust settling slowly in his wake. When the road grew quiet again, Samuel resumed his work without comment, and Clara folded the mended shirt carefully before handing it back, their fingers brushing only long enough to pass the fabric. And in that small exchange there was something stronger than public approval, something built not on appearance, but on shared effort under an open Kansas sky. Word traveled faster than the wind across Dry Creek, and by the next afternoon more than one pair of eyes had drifted toward the outer road where Samuel Reed's modest ranch stood against the open prairie, because nothing unsettled a small town more than a story that refused to follow its expected ending. Clara May Whitmore arrived just after 8 o'clock, the sun already warming the fence posts, carrying not only her sewing kit, but a small basket of bread she had baked before dawn in Mrs. Garrison's kitchen in exchange for flour and oven space. Her steps confident along the quarter-mile stretch that now felt less like exile and more like direction. Samuel was in the corral checking a length of rope when he noticed her, and there was no surprise in his expression, only acknowledgement, as if her return had been considered and accepted without announcement. She set the basket on an overturned crate near the barn door and explained that strong hands required strong meals, her tone practical rather than tender, and he responded with a faint smile that deepened the lines at the corners of his eyes. Together they worked through the morning, Clara repairing not only feed sacks but a canvas cover for the wagon that had torn along one edge, her stitches firm and evenly spaced, each pull of thread drawing frayed cloth back into usefulness. The prairie wind moved steadily across the fields, lifting loose strands of her hair and carrying the distant low of cattle, and in that wide space the memory of laughter at the depot seemed smaller, reduced to something almost weightless. Near noon 2 ranch hands from town rode past at a slow pace, their horses stirring dust that glimmered in the sunlight, and though they did not stop, their glances lingered long enough to measure the scene. Clara seated with needle in hand, Samuel beside her mending a latch, the yard orderly and quiet. One of the riders tipped his hat in a gesture that was neither mockery nor full respect, simply curiosity adjusting its posture. Clara felt the shift, subtle but present, the way opinion can bend when confronted with steadiness. She rose to stretch her back, looking out over the open land that stretched nearly a mile beyond the fence line, and Samuel joined her at the gate, both of them standing side by side without pretense, watching the horizon where sky met earth in a clean, unbroken line. There was no grand declaration, no promise spoken aloud, only shared labor and the calm that follows honest effort. When Samuel thanked her for the work, he did so plainly, adding that a ranch required more than muscle. It required care, and care could not be ordered through a newspaper advertisement. Clara absorbed the words without lowering her gaze, understanding that value spoken quietly carries more truth than praise shouted in public. As the afternoon light softened, and the town's distant chatter drifted faintly on the breeze, it became clear that something had shifted beyond a single repaired seam, because Dry Creek might have decided her worth in one morning. But the prairie, wide and patient, was beginning to tell a different story, one measured not by the curve of a waist, but by the strength of what a person chooses to build under an open sky. By the end of the week, Clara May Whitmore's footsteps along the outer road had become as regular as sunrise, and Dry Creek began to notice not because she demanded attention, but because she no longer tried to avoid it. Each morning she left the boarding house just after 7 o'clock, her sewing kit balanced against her hip, her stride unhurried. Passing the general store and the cafe where conversations dipped slightly in volume as she went by, not out of open scorn now, but out of recalculation. At Samuel Reed's ranch the work had grown beyond mending sacks. She had reorganized the small pantry inside the house, labeling jars in careful script, measuring flour and sugar with the precision of someone who understood that order could quiet even the most restless room. And she had patched the curtains in the front window so that afternoon light fell cleanly across the wooden table instead of through frayed edges. Samuel watched these changes with thoughtful silence, aware that what she repaired was not only fabric but atmosphere, the house shifting from a place maintained by habit into one tended with intention. One afternoon he returned from checking the far fence line, nearly a mile east, to find the barn swept and the tools arranged by size along the wall, the handles wiped free of dust, and he paused in the doorway, hat in hand, absorbing the transformation without comment. Clara met his gaze and simply said that tools last longer when they are respected, and he nodded, understanding that the statement carried meaning beyond wood and iron. Meanwhile, in town, Ethan Caldwell continued to host gatherings on his broad porch, speaking confidently about cattle prices and expansion plans. Yet the story of the woman he had dismissed began to sound less amusing with each retelling, because there were now witnesses who had ridden past the Reed Ranch and seen the neat fence, the repaired wagon cover, the steady partnership unfolding without spectacle. One evening at the cafe, a ranch hand remarked that Samuel's spread looked better kept than it had in years, and another added that strong work did not always arrive in the shape one expects. And though no one mentioned Clara by name, the implications settled like dust on a quiet table. Clara herself remained unaware of the shifting tone, focused instead on the rhythm of her days, the feel of needle and thread, the scent of bread baking in Samuel's oven, the low murmur of cattle settling at dusk. As autumn edged closer and the evenings cooled by a few degrees, she began staying later to help prepare simple suppers, setting 2 plates instead of 1 without ceremony. And Samuel, who had grown accustomed to solitary meals, found the silence at his table altered, not louder, but warmer. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and indifferent to gossip, the horizon unchanged. Yet within that vastness something steady was forming, built not on apology or spectacle, but on consistent presence. And in the quiet space between labor and lamplight, It became clear that worth proven daily carries more weight than any first impression spoken on a wooden platform. The first cold wind of October rolled across the prairie without warning, bending the tall grass nearly flat and rattling the loose tin along Samuel Reed's barn roof. And Clara May Whitmore stood at the kitchen window, watching the sky shift from pale blue to a restless gray, sensing that weather was not the only thing changing in Dry Creek. That morning a notice had been tacked to the post outside the general store announcing a town harvest supper to be held the following Saturday evening. An event meant to gather every rancher and merchant within 10 miles. And by noon the invitation had reached Samuel's fence line through a neighbor who rode past and mentioned it casually. Though his eyes lingered with interest, Clara read the handbill later when she walked into town for flour, the paper fluttering under a nail, and she felt the familiar tightening in her chest, because public gatherings carried memory, and memory carried risk. Inside the store, Mr. Talbot weighed sugar while two women discussed the supper menu, their conversation pausing only briefly as Clara approached the counter. And this time the silence did not sharpen into ridicule, it settled into consideration. She paid for her flour and turned to leave when Ethan Caldwell entered, his boots striking the wooden floor with practiced confidence. And for a moment the room held both past and present in the same narrow space. His gaze found her quickly, lingering not with mockery, but with something closer to assessment, as if he were measuring what time and quiet labor had altered. He remarked that the harvest supper would be well attended, and that Samuel Reed would likely bring strong cattle numbers this season. His tone neutral, almost cordial, and Clara answered simply that good work often speaks for itself. The exchange drew the attention of those nearby, not because of raised voices but because of their absence, and Ethan inclined his head in a gesture that suggested acknowledgement rather than dismissal before moving toward the back of the store. When Clara stepped outside, the wind had strengthened, tugging at her shawl and lifting dust along Main Street, and she stood for a moment reading the handbill once more, her name not written anywhere on it, yet somehow implied in the shifting currents of town opinion. Back at the ranch, she placed the flour on the counter and began kneading dough for bread, while Samuel repaired a loose hinge by the door, and she mentioned the supper in a tone that carried neither eagerness nor reluctance. Samuel listened, wiping his hands on a clean cloth, and said that the town gathered rarely without purpose, and perhaps it was time to attend without apology. Clara felt the weight of that statement settle gently, understanding that stepping into a crowded room would require more courage than mending any seam. Yet she also sensed that absence would allow old judgments to stand unchallenged. As the bread rose near the stove and the wind pressed steadily against the windows, the small house felt anchored despite the weather, and Clara realized that the coming supper was not merely a meal but a quiet crossroads, a place where whispers might either fade or sharpen. And under the steady gaze of a man who had never measured her by inches, she began to consider that walking into that room beside him could alter more than one opinion in Dry Creek. Saturday evening arrived with a sky the color of burnished copper. The wind finally eased after days of restless gusts, and the lanterns strung along Dry Creek's main street flickered to life one by one as if the town itself were drawing a steady breath. Clara May Whitmore stood inside Samuel Reed's small ranch house, adjusting the simple dark green dress she had altered with her own hands, the fabric modest and unadorned yet fitted with care. And when she looked into the narrow mirror above the washstand, she did not search for flaw. She searched for steadiness and found it waiting. Samuel stepped in from the porch wearing a freshly brushed coat and a clean white shirt she had mended weeks earlier, the seam along the sleeve nearly invisible now. And he paused when he saw her, not with surprise but with quiet regard, as though he understood that courage sometimes looks like a woman choosing to walk into a room that once measured her unfairly. They traveled the half-mile into town, by wagon, wheels rolling over packed earth, the sound rhythmic and grounding. And as they approached the lit windows of the assembly hall, the murmur of gathered voices drifted outward like low thunder before rain. Inside, long wooden tables stretched nearly the length of the room, covered in white cloths and platters of roast chicken, corn bread, and apple pie, and conversations faltered the moment Samuel and Clara stepped across the threshold. The silence was not harsh, not cruel, but charged with awareness, every eye tracing the space between them as if seeking confirmation of something unspoken. Samuel removed his hat and nodded politely to those nearest the door, guiding Clara toward an open place at the center table rather than along the wall, and the simple act of choosing the middle rather than the edge altered the shape of the room. Ethan Caldwell stood near the far end speaking with the mayor, his posture straight, his expression confident, yet when he noticed the pair taking their seats, he paused mid-sentence, the words lingering unfinished. Clara felt the weight of those glances but kept her movements calm, unfolding her napkin, smoothing the cloth before her plate, acknowledging greetings offered in tones that now carried a hint of respect rather than amusement. Mrs. Garrison approached with a small smile and placed a dish before Clara, remarking that her bread at the boarding house had grown quite popular, and a few heads turned at that detail, recalculating what they thought they knew. As the meal progressed and conversation resumed, the initial tension thinned, replaced by cautious curiosity, neighbors asking Samuel about his repaired fences and improved yields, others complimenting the neatness of his wagon cover, and each time he answered plainly, he allowed his gaze to drift briefly toward Clara, as if credit were shared without announcement. Midway through the evening, the mayor called for a brief word of thanks to the ranchers, who had strengthened the town through steady work, and when he mentioned Samuel Reed by name for the noticeable improvement of his property over the past month, a soft ripple of acknowledgement moved through the hall. Clara lowered her eyes for a moment, not from embarrassment, but from recognition that quiet labor had begun to speak louder than any first impression. Across the room, Ethan watched, his expression unreadable, and though no apology crossed his lips, the absence of mockery carried its own weight. Under the warm glow of lantern light, with plates cleared and music beginning softly in the corner, Dry Creek found itself adjusting not to a spectacle, but to a simple truth, that worth revealed over time cannot be denied by a single careless sentence. And as Samuel rose to offer Clara his hand for a modest turn around the floor, the room did not laugh, it watched. And in that watchful silence, something shifted permanently in the measure of her place among them. The music in the assembly hall softened as the evening drew toward its close, lantern flames burning lower and casting long shadows across the wooden floor, and Clara May Whitmore stood beside Samuel Reed near the open doorway, where cool autumn air slipped inside in quiet breaths. The earlier tension had thinned into something almost thoughtful, conversations now carrying her name without a whisper attached, and when neighbors passed they offered nods that felt earned rather than obligated. Samuel's hand rested lightly at the small of her back as they stepped outside, not possessive, simply steady, and the night sky above Dry Creek stretched wide and clear, stars bright against the dark Kansas expanse. Behind them the laughter from inside the hall rose and fell like a tide that no longer threatened to pull her under. As they walked toward the wagon, boots crunching over gravel, Ethan Caldwell's voice called out from the porch steps, and for a moment the past and present stood within a few feet of one another again. He descended slowly, hat in hand, his usual certainty tempered by something closer to reflection, and he spoke plainly, saying that he had misjudged in haste, and that the town had perhaps done the same. There was no grand apology, no dramatic gesture, only a measured admission offered under open sky. Clara listened without lowering her gaze, her posture straight, her expression calm. And when she answered, she did so with the same quiet strength she had carried since the depot, telling him that judgment made quickly rarely measures accurately, and that some things require time to reveal their worth. Samuel remained silent beside her, not intervening, allowing her words to stand on their own. Ethan nodded once, the motion small but sincere, and stepped back toward the hall, leaving the space between them cleared of the tension that had once filled it. As the wagon wheels began to turn and Dry Creek's lantern light receded behind them, Clara felt the cool night air brush her face and understood that forgiveness does not always require closeness, only clarity. The prairie lay ahead, vast and patient, the road stretching nearly a mile before bending toward the Reed Ranch, and Samuel guided the horses with an easy hand. After a few quiet minutes he spoke, not about the supper or the town, but about the coming winter and the repairs still needed on the barn roof, his tone practical, yet threaded with an unspoken invitation to remain. Clara looked out over the fields silvered by moonlight and realized that the choice before her no longer revolved around escape or endurance. It centered on belonging. When the ranch house came into view, its single window glowing warmly in the distance, Samuel slowed the wagon and turned slightly toward her, his voice low and steady as he said that a house can be repaired alone, but it is built stronger with two. He did not kneel, did not reach for spectacle. He simply extended his hand across the small space between them. Clara placed her gloved hand in his, feeling the calluses earned through honest labor, and in that quiet exchange beneath an endless sky, the measure of her life shifted not because a town approved, but because she chose the man who had never asked her to be smaller than she was. Winter arrived gently over the prairie, not with fury but with quiet persistence, frost tracing delicate lines along the fence posts at Samuel Reed's ranch, while a thin layer of snow settled across the fields like a clean page waiting to be written on, and inside the small white house at the bend of the road, Clara May Whitmore stood at the kitchen table kneading dough as morning light filtered through the mended curtains she had once stitched with careful hands. Months had passed since the harvest supper, and Dry Creek no longer spoke her name in lowered tones. Instead, it carried on as towns do, busy with trade and weather and small concerns. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the way doors opened when she entered. Samuel moved about the barn with steady purpose, his coat pulled tight against the cold, and when he returned to the house his boots left faint prints on the wooden floor that Clara would later wipe clean without complaint, because shared work no longer felt like burden but rhythm. The ranch itself had changed in subtle ways, fences standing straighter, tools hung in orderly rows, the wagon cover strong against wind, and neighbors who once rode past with curiosity now stopped at the gate to ask advice about repairs or bread that kept well through freezing nights. One clear afternoon, as the sky stretched bright and sharp above the snow-covered prairie, Clara walked into town beside Samuel, her arm resting comfortably in his, and there was no spectacle in their presence, no murmured judgment, only the ordinary warmth of recognition. At the general store, Mr. Talbot greeted her by name and asked after her latest batch of bread, and Mrs. Garrison pressed a folded letter into her hand from a cousin back east who had heard through word of mouth that Clara had found steady footing in Kansas. Even Ethan Caldwell tipped his hat with respectful distance when their paths crossed. His earlier certainty softened into something humbler, and though no further words were needed, the acknowledgment stood as quiet testament to growth. That evening, as dusk settled over Dry Creek, and the prairie wind carried the scent of wood smoke across the mile-long stretch between town and ranch, Clara stood on the porch watching the sun dip low, its final light turning the snow to gold, and Samuel joined her without speaking, his presence steady as ever. He did not ask whether she regretted staying, and she did not speak of what might have been had she boarded that train, because both understood that the measure of a life is not found in the shape others expect, but in the strength one chooses to stand with. The house behind them glowed warm against the cold, a simple structure built not on pride or spectacle, but on patience and shared effort. And as the last light faded and the prairie fell into deep blue silence, Clara realized that the journey which began with dismissal had led not to bitterness but to belonging. Out here, beneath an endless sky that judges no one by inches or rumor, worth reveals itself in the quietest ways, in mended seams, in steady hands, in a man who never asked her to be smaller than she was, and in that stillness, with wind whispering across open land, justice arrived not as thunder but as peace.